Hello there. If you're here, then perhaps you're ready to let your thoughts slow down, to rest, to drift. Maybe even fall asleep, but not quite yet. Because before you do, I'd like to take you somewhere else for a little while. Not far, just far enough. Close your eyes if you like, and imagine the dry warmth of an early morning sun settling on pale stone. There's the smell of olive trees in the distance, of dust, of bread baking, of fig leaves warming in the breeze. You hear the soft rustle of linen, the scratch of sandals on compacted earth, a faint chorus of roosters somewhere out beyond the courtyards. You're waking up in an ancient world. This is Greece, not the mythical Greece of Homer's heroes or the gods of Olympus, but the Greece of ordinary people. Mothers, potters, shepherds, children. The kind of people whose names were never written in marble, but whose hands, whose lives, built the world we now call ancient. Tonight, or today, or whenever you need a quiet moment, we'll explore the details of daily life in ancient Greece. Mostly in Athens, yes, but also in the mountain towns of Arcadia, the farmlands of Thessaly, the port of Corinth, the island of Delos, and the austere hills of Sparta. Not through wars or grand speeches, but through bread and cloth, through clay and water, through the quiet business of living. This won't be a lecture, and it won't be rushed. We'll take our time, wandering slowly through a day, and then another. We'll drift into homes, onto farms, through dusty streets, into temples and workshops and still, shadowed courtyards. We'll learn, gently, how people worked, what they wore, what they ate, how they bathed, sang, married, celebrated, aged, and passed on their wisdom. If you find your thoughts softening, if you fall asleep before we reach the end, that's just fine. This story will still be here when you wake up, and if you don't, then you'll simply drift further into the ancient world, moment by moment, detail by detail. So come with me. Slowly, let's begin. Imagine for a moment the Greek world around 430 BCE. Athens is at its peak, a bustling, brilliant city of temples, drama, politics, and innovation. It's a democracy, though not in the way we think of it now. Only adult men who were born of Athenian parents can vote. Women, children, slaves, and immigrants, known as metics, have no political voice. But that doesn't mean they don't shape the city. They do. They build its walls, carry its water, paint its pottery, grow its food, raise its children. And not far beyond Athens, the Greek world fans, out across hundreds of independent city-states, what the Greeks called polis, each with its own customs, its own festivals, its own dialect and gods and rhythms of life. Some are famous, Sparta, with its warrior code and plain speech. Others are forgotten, like Thespiae in Boeotia, or Tegea in the mountains of the Peloponnese. But all are part of the living world we'll visit tonight. Let's start in the early morning, not with fanfare or drama, but in the quiet hush before the day begins. Imagine waking just before sunrise, not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the gentle creak of wood, the whisper of wind through clay roof tiles, and the stirring of animals. You're in a small home, perhaps in the heart of Athens, or in a sun-bleached village nestled among olive groves. The house is simple. The walls are made of sun-dried mud brick, cool to the touch in the early morning. The floor is packed earth, swept smooth. A central courtyard lies open to the sky, surrounded by a few rooms. In winter, the hearth is the center of warmth and life. In summer, it's the shade of the courtyard that draws the family together. You rise from a woven mat, stretch your limbs, and wash your face with cool water from a ceramic basin. There is no running water. Most homes collect rainwater in cisterns or rely on public fountains. You might anoint yourself with a little oil, olive oil, perhaps mixed with herbs or scented with resin. Not out of luxury, but habit. It softens the skin, keeps off the dust. You dress simply, a light tunic called a chiton, fastened at the shoulders with pins. If it's chilly, you wrap a hamation, a long wool cloak, around your shoulders. There are no closets. Clothing is minimal and handmade, often woven by someone in your own household. You probably have only a few garments, each well used and carefully mended. And as the sun lifts higher, life begins to stir. Let's stay for a moment with the women of the house. In Athens, respectable women of citizen families were expected to live mostly within the home. Their world was the gynecium, the women's quarters, a part of the house reserved for weaving, managing food, raising children, and preparing for religious festivals. Don't mistake it for idleness. The life of a woman in ancient Greece was full of work, quiet, constant, invisible work. There is grain to be ground, by hand, using a heavy stone mill. It's slow, rhythmic labor. The hum of the grinding stone is familiar, meditative, almost like breathing. Flour becomes dough. Dough becomes flat, dense loaves baked in simple ovens or on heated stones. Water must be fetched, often from a public fountain or spring, carried in heavy clay amphorae on shoulders or heads. This chore is done by women and girls, sometimes several times a day. In the corner, a spindle hums as wool is spun into thread. The women of the house, from young daughters to elderly grandmothers, may all take part in the cycle of cloth making, cleaning, carding, spinning, dyeing, and weaving on an upright loom. The colors are soft, undyed white, faded ochre, rust red. The dyes come from plants, roots, crushed insects. As the morning grows warm, the household is already at work. Men preparing for the market or the fields, slaves or servants attending to errands, children waking and eating simple meals of bread soaked in wine or goat's milk. Let's step outside now, gently. The sun is rising higher, and the city is beginning to hum with life. In Athens, the streets are narrow and winding. Dust clings to sandals. Chickens peck at scraps. Neighbors call out greetings from shaded doorways. Vendors are setting up stalls. Baskets of olives, figs, fish still glistening from the morning catch. Potters arrange painted vases, some purely functional, others decorated with dancing figures or mythic scenes. The agora, the open market, is the heart of civic life. Here philosophers gather to speak and debate. Craftsmen sell their wares. Citizens meet to talk, exchange news, or discuss the issues of the day. It's lively, but not frantic. There's no rush here, just the steady flow of daily business. In the countryside, it's different. The farms begin to stir earlier, with the light. The farmer walks behind a wooden plough pulled by oxen. Olive trees are pruned with practiced hands. Grapevines are trained along stone terraces. In summer, fields of barley ripple like the sea. In autumn, the grape harvest fills the air with the scent of crushed fruit. In spring, flocks of sheep dot the hills, their bells chiming gently in the distance. It's hard work, yes, but deeply connected to the turning of seasons and the pulse of the earth. The rhythms are slow, ancient, steady as breath. We'll stop here for now. But this is just the beginning. In the next section, we'll spend time in the home, learning more about food, family, and the texture of daily living. We'll explore how people cooked, what they ate, how they told stories, taught their children, and welcomed the gods into their households. All of it slowly, carefully, as if we were there. Until then, let your mind settle into the silence of an ancient morning, and let the stillness of that world drift softly over you. You're still in that house. The air is warmer now. Sunlight pours into the courtyard, casting soft, pale rectangles across the flagstones. Somewhere in the back of the house, a wooden door creaks on its hinge. A rooster flaps lazily onto a low wall. A child laughs, quickly, then disappears again behind a doorway. This is home. And home, in ancient Greece, was not just a place to sleep or eat. It was a small, self-contained world. The Greek word for house is oikos. It means much more than the physical structure. It includes the family, the property, the possessions, and the people, enslaved or free, who belong to it. From this word, we get economy, oikonomia, the management of the household. The oikos was where nearly everything began. It was where values were taught, food was prepared, wool was woven, gods were honored, and memories lived. Each house was its own little cosmos, a quiet living system. Let's take our time inside one of these homes. Most houses, even in wealthy districts of Athens, were modest by modern standards. There were no marble columns or wide windows. Instead, the walls were made of mud brick or stone, plastered over and painted with simple lime. The roofs were flat or gently sloped, made of wooden beams and terracotta tiles. Some houses were whitewashed. Others were colored with faded red or yellow pigments. Doors were wooden, often bolted from inside. Glass was rare, so windows were small, usually covered with shutters or thin cloth to keep out dust and insects. There were no front yards. Instead, a single door opened directly onto the street. Privacy was deeply valued, especially among wealthier households. From the outside, many houses looked nearly identical. Blank, featureless walls giving no hint of what lay within. But inside, there was life. Quiet, structured, rhythmic life. At the center of the house was the courtyard, open to the sky, often shaded by an awning or fig tree. This was the beating heart of the home. Here, children played, meals were prepared, water was drawn from a cistern, animals were sometimes kept, and in warm weather, people gathered to talk or work. The floor might be paved with stone, packed with clay, or simply left as hard earth. At one edge, there might be a stone hearth, used for cooking and warmth, especially in winter. Chickens might wander in. Cats were welcome, especially where grain was stored. Around the courtyard were several rooms, depending on the family's wealth and needs. Some were used for sleeping, simple spaces with mats or low wooden beds. Others were for storage, grain, oil, amphorae of wine, dried herbs, spare tools. There was no running water, no plumbing, no glass, no artificial light beyond oil lamps made of clay. But the house functioned like a living thing. Warm in winter, cool in summer, changing with the seasons. In wealthier homes, the layout was more structured. There were distinct areas for men and women. The andron, or men's room, was used for hosting male guests, especially for symposia, drinking parties with reclining couches, conversation, and shared wine. It was usually near the entrance, keeping guests from seeing the rest of the home. The gynoeceum, or women's quarters, lay deeper inside, offering privacy and protection from public view. This was where weaving happened, where clothing was mended, where children were bathed, where quiet songs were sung and stories were passed from mother to daughter. In some homes, there were upper floors, reached by narrow staircases, usually wooden. These might house older children, storage, or sleeping quarters. The stairs creaked. Dust settled between the boards. Light filtered through the slats of shutters, painting faint stripes on the walls. Everything was slow, and everything had its place. Let's pause here, not to rush, but to take in the ordinary. Imagine the morning routines inside one of these homes. The first light enters the courtyard. You can hear it before you see it. The coo of doves nesting on the roof, the soft hiss of water being poured, the scrape of wood against stone as someone opens the door. A young girl helps her mother knead dough made from barley flour. The yeast is natural, captured from the air over generations. Nearby, her older sister spins wool into thread. The spindle turns slowly, her fingers moving with practiced ease. A boy wakes and folds his bedding. He'll help gather kindling for the hearth before walking with his father to the agora. Perhaps he's learning a trade, pottery, leatherwork, or stone cutting. The grandmother sits in a shaded corner of the courtyard, grinding herbs with a stone mortar, sage, oregano, maybe a bit of thyme. In another part of the house, someone prepares breakfast. Akratisma, the morning meal. It's simple. A piece of bread dipped in watered wine. Children might eat boiled lentils, cheese, or dried figs if the household is well stocked. The air smells faintly of olive oil and charcoal, of dry dust and warmed clay. Now consider who's in this home. Not just the family, but possibly servants, and almost certainly enslaved people. Slavery was a widespread and accepted institution in ancient Greece, part of both urban and rural life. Slaves might be born into servitude, captured in war, or purchased at markets. They could be domestic servants, nurses, tutors, farmhands, or skilled artisans. Some were treated kindly, even loved. Others were not. Their lives were lived quietly, often in the background, unrecorded, but deeply interwoven with the household. Their voices are mostly lost to us, but their labor was constant, fetching water, preparing meals, tending the fire, helping with children, cleaning, weaving. Let's return now to the physical space. Picture the household gods. Many Greek homes had a small altar or shrine, perhaps in the courtyard or near the hearth, where the family honored Hestia, the goddess of the hearth and home. Offerings might be simple: a splash of wine, a piece of fruit, a pinch of grain. These small rituals were woven into the fabric of daily life. Quiet moments of reverence, simple, habitual acts that connected the household to the divine. Other gods might also be honored depending on the day. Hermes, protector of doorways and travel. Apollo for healing. Demeter for the health of the crops. Zeus. Ktesios, a household aspect of Zeus, was sometimes represented by a small jar, kept in a private space, symbolizing prosperity and protection. These devotions were not grand. They were gentle, almost instinctive, part of the rhythm of living. Evening comes slowly in the home. The sun dips low, and the house grows quiet. Shadows stretch across the courtyard. The smells change: cooking oil, roasted onions, fish grilled on coals. A second meal, deipnon, is shared. Not in grand halls, but often sitting or reclining on cushions, with food served on clay dishes. Families eat together, though in some homes men and women eat separately. The meal might include barley cakes, olives, lentils, garlic, cheese, and seasonal greens. Meat is rare, mostly eaten at festivals. More often it's dried fish, pulses, or boiled vegetables. After the meal, hands are washed. The remnants of food are swept away. A few words of thanks may be murmured to the gods. The fire is banked. Lamps are lit, small, shallow bowls with floating wicks, burning olive oil with a soft glow. Some families talk, others sit in quiet. A lyre might be played, a story told, one remembered from childhood, or a fable. And slowly, one by one, they drift towards sleep. wrapped in cloaks, on simple bedding, on mats, or wool-stuffed mattresses if they are wealthy. The night air cools the house, crickets begin their music, and the soft hush of ancient sleep returns. We'll stop here once more. Next, we'll follow the flow of the day outward, from the home to the market, the workshop, the fields. We'll learn how the ancient Greeks worked, what trades they practiced, how their communities functioned, and how time was shaped by the needs of labor and the pulse of the seasons. But for now, rest. You've learned the shape of a home, and perhaps, if you're listening in the quiet hours of night, you too can feel the warmth of clay underfoot, the slow hush of oil being poured, the rhythm of life, gentle, lived, and deeply human. The light shifts again. A new day rises. Not the gentle hush of morning inside the home, but the stir of motion beyond it. The city begins to stretch. Voices echo softly off stone walls. Tools clink, footsteps shuffle. The business of labor begins. In ancient Greece, work was not a separate category of life. It was life, woven into the fabric of morning, noon, and dusk. Each task, be it farming, shoemaking, fishing, baking, or shaping clay, was a rhythm, a practice, something learned through years passed from father to son, mother to daughter, master to apprentice. Not all labor was equal. Some was praised, some quietly disdained. But all of it, each motion of hand to tool, each harvest, each song hummed while spinning wool, held meaning in the eyes of those who lived it. Let's walk slowly into their world. Let's begin with the land. Most Greeks, even in bustling cities like Athens, had strong ties to the countryside. Farming wasn't just a profession, it was survival, a steady, circular devotion to the soil. Greek farms were small by modern standards. A family might tend a few acres, often inherited across generations. The land was rocky in many places, especially in Attica. The soil thin, rain unpredictable, but still, the land gave what it could. Olives were life. The trees were hardy, able to grow on hillsides and poor soil. Their fruit could be pressed into oil, stored, traded, or used for cooking, light, and ritual. Vines wove through the terraces, their fruit harvested each autumn. Wine was not a luxury. It was a staple, diluted with water, drunk daily in moderation. Barley and wheat were the staple grains. Barley was easier to grow in poor soil and was used for making bread, porridge, and barley cakes. Figs, onions, beans, garlic, lentils, and greens rounded out the diet. Fruit trees, almonds, pomegranates, apples were treasured. Work in the fields followed the seasons. In late autumn, the grain was sown. In spring, weeds were pulled and irrigation checked. In early summer, the grain was harvested with sickles, then threshed and winnowed by hand. Oxen ploughed. Goats grazed the hillsides. Sheep were shorn in late spring. Bees were kept in clay hives, buzzing softly beneath olive branches. There was no mechanical noise, only birdsong, the scrape of tools, and the breath of the wind. It was hard work, but it was honest, and it carried with it the deep quiet of the earth. In the cities, labor looked different. Let's imagine you walking through an Athenian workshop quarter. The air smells of charcoal and dye. Shops line the dusty street. Small, open-fronted rooms where craftsmen labor in view of passers-by. The noise is gentle but constant. Hammers tapping copper, chisels striking marble, the rasp of leather being cut. Inside one shop, a potter leans over his wheel. His hands are wet with clay, shaping a vessel as the wheel turns beneath his foot. The vase will dry slowly in the sun, then be fired in a kiln at the edge of town. Once hardened, it may be painted, perhaps with red figure scenes of a dancing satyr, or black silhouettes of athletes in motion. Nearby, a cobbler repairs a sandal. His tools are simple: awl, knife, hammer. He works quickly, but not without care. The soul must be strong enough to walk the city's uneven paths. In another shop, a metal worker sharpens a sickle. Sparks drift quietly to the ground. Work is often done outdoors. Some craftsmen sit cross-legged in the shade, sewing or weaving. Others stretch cloth to dye it with herbs, woad, madder or saffron, dipping it in vats and hanging it to dry like banners of colour. Each shop has its own smell, its own tempo. Most craftsmen were not wealthy, but some owned their tools, their space, and their trade. A few might train apprentices or employ slaves to help with the labour. Skills were learned slowly by watching, repeating, and refining. A potter's hands moved with instinct. A weaver's fingers danced across the warp. The body remembered what the mind barely needed to think about. Time was measured not by clocks, but by the sun's position. Work stopped when the light faded, or when the task was done, or when the body asked for rest. In the heat of the afternoon, many paused. The streets grew quiet. Dogs lay in shaded doorways. People drank water mixed with vinegar, called oxymel, to cool the body and sharpen the mind. Then, slowly, the city stirred again. Let's talk about women's work, which rarely took place in the agora or the open market, but was no less demanding. As we've seen, weaving was central. Wool, carded, spun, dyed and woven was a major domestic duty. Cloth wasn't purchased, it was made. Women learned early to handle the spindle and loom. The process was long, rhythmic, and deeply skilled. Patterns were simple or intricate, depending on the family's need. Some cloth was for everyday wear. Other pieces, more finely made, were saved for dowries, offerings, or burial shrouds. Bread making was another daily task. Grain was ground in heavy querns. Dough was shaped by hand. Baking took place in clay ovens. Some households had their own. Others shared neighborhood ovens. Soap was rare. Olive oil and ash were used for cleaning. Laundry was done at public fountains or rivers, rubbed by hand on flat stones, then left to dry in the sun. Other tasks included caring for animals, preparing meals, managing stores, and making household remedies from herbs. And always there were children to raise, elders to care for, guests to host, rituals to maintain. Even in homes where slaves were present, the women of the house supervised closely. The mistress was expected to manage the household with discipline and honor. Now imagine a small fishing village. The harbour is calm in the morning. Nets hang to dry. Fishermen rise early, before light. They move quietly, paddling into deeper waters, casting nets by hand. Fish is a central part of the Greek diet, especially for those near the coast. Sardines, anchovies, mackerel, and squid were common. Larger fish were prized and sold fresh, salted or dried. Boats were small, made of wood, coated in pitch. The oars creaked. Sea salt crusted every surface. At the docks, women wait with baskets. Salt is ready. Fires are lit for cooking. The fish are gutted, smoked, packed or grilled. Some are traded for grain or cheese. Others are taken home for supper. Inland people raised chickens, goats and pigs. Milk was turned into soft cheeses, creamy, salted, sometimes herbed. Goats were milked twice a day. Chickens gave eggs, and pigs were fattened for sacrifice or feast. Most families relied on a mix of what they could grow, gather, make and barter. Markets helped fill the gaps, but self-sufficiency was a quiet necessity. Let's pause with a single worker. He might be a stonemason, carving a column capital for a temple, or a carpenter, shaving wood to build a chest or stool. His tools are simple: a bronze chisel, a wooden mallet, a line of cord. The marks he leaves are clean and precise, meant to last. He works slowly, measuring twice, carving once. The dust clings to his arms. There is no rush, only the stone, the chisel, the sound it makes as it yields. It is the same sound his father once heard, and his grandfather before him. Work is not glamorous, but it is enduring. Now imagine the end of the day. In the workshops, tools are wiped clean and hung on nails or tucked into baskets. The last of the die vats is covered. The embers of the blacksmith's forge glow low. In the fields, oxen are led home. The last figs are gathered. The earth is still. There is weariness, but also peace. The kind of peace that comes from having made or grown or fixed something. In the Greek view, to work with your hands was not always considered noble. Philosophers sometimes dismissed it as banosic, too manual, too concerned with the body. But in truth, most people lived by such labor, and many took quiet pride in it, to shape a vase, to shear a sheep, to feed your family with the barley you sowed. These were acts of care, acts of memory, acts of living. We'll end this section here. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore leisure. Yes, even ancient Greeks had their ways of resting, celebrating, and enjoying beauty. We'll visit theatres, baths, music, games, and the joys of quiet conversation beneath a vine-covered porch. But for now, let the tools rest, let the fire go out, and let the soft hush of the working day slip gently into the silence of evening. You are surrounded by the sounds of peace, and in that peace, the memory of hands, shaping, crafting, sewing, continues quietly, like a heartbeat. The sun begins to lower in the sky. The light takes on that late afternoon softness, warmer, slower, casting long shadows across stone courtyards and dusty roads. The work of the day is finished, or nearly so, and in this gentle space between effort and nightfall, there is room for something quieter. Rest, beauty, leisure. For all their labor, ancient Greeks were no strangers to stillness. They valued rhythm, not the constant pulse of activity, but the rising and falling of effort and ease. The mind, they believed, needed room to wander. The body needed care. The soul, time to reflect and restore. Let's explore that together. In the home, after the bread has cooled and the last wool has been folded, the courtyard becomes a place for conversation. Children sit near their grandparents, listening to stories from long ago. A father and daughter watch the sky together, naming stars. A mother braids her younger child's hair, gently untangling knots with oiled fingers. Even these small moments were part of daily leisure. Not elaborate, not planned, but full of quiet connection. In wealthier homes, men might recline in the undrun, the men's room, on low couches, sipping diluted wine from shallow cups called kailikes. They talk, sometimes debate, sometimes sing short poems, or recite verses passed down from memory. The symposium, a formal gathering, was more structured. Guests reclined on couches around a central space, each bringing his own cushion and cup. Wine was mixed with water in a large crater and poured by a young servant, often a boy or enslaved person, chosen for his grace. The evening passed in stages. Conversation gave way to music, music to games, games to silence or sleep. Topics ranged from philosophy to friendship, from myth to daily trouble. But the point was not the topic. It was the pleasure of the company, the rhythm of talk, the presence of others. Outside the home, leisure took many forms. Public baths were not yet the grand institutions they would become in Roman times, but bathing was still a ritual, done with care. Water was drawn from public fountains, heated over coals, poured into basins. Oils were rubbed into the skin, then scraped away with a curved metal tool called a strigil. This left the body clean, scented, relaxed. Athenian men might visit the gymnasium, not just for exercise, but for bathing, stretching, and conversation. The gymnasium was an open-air space surrounded by columns. Men trained in wrestling, discus, running, but they also read poetry, listened to teachers, and shared food in the shade of olive trees. It was a place of the body, yes, but also of the mind. Women's leisure was different, often quieter, more private. There were no public gymnasia for women, but within the home, time was made for adornment, song, and preparation for festivals. Cosmetics were used, not to impress others, but to participate in rituals of beauty and care. Ashes, ochre, and crushed minerals made rouge for the cheeks. Kohl outlined the eyes. Scented oils, often infused with myrrh, rose, or cinnamon, were massaged into the hair and neck. Hair was brushed slowly with bone combs, braided, pinned, or bound with ribbons. Clothing, freshly woven and dyed, was laid out for special days. This kind of self-care was not seen as vanity. It was part of honoring the gods, especially during festivals and rites of passage. And it was a shared experience between mothers and daughters, sisters, friends, even neighbors. Music was everywhere, not in concert halls or theaters, but in everyday moments. Children sang while playing, workers hummed as they labored, shepherds piped on reed flutes as they watched their flocks. Lyres were common, small stringed instruments plucked with the fingers. They were light enough to carry, simple enough to learn, and expressive enough to accompany song or story. The aulos, a double reed instrument, produced a sharper, more haunting sound. It was played at festivals, in rituals, or to accompany dramatic performances. Women sang while weaving. Young men sang rowing songs at sea. Even funerals were marked by laments, carefully composed, deeply moving songs of remembrance. The rhythm of Greek life was musical, measured, flowing, with space for harmony and breath. Games, too, had their place. Children played with dolls made of clay or cloth. Some had movable arms or painted faces. Others played with hoops, knuckle bones, or balls made of pig bladder wrapped in cloth. In the courtyard, children played chasing games, versions of tag or hide and seek. They recited rhymes, told riddles, and laughed in high, clear voices. Adults enjoyed games of strategy, like patea, played with pebbles on a marked board, or early forms of dice and counting games. Leisure didn't always mean doing nothing. It often meant doing something slowly, with intention, turning the mind away from worry and towards something rhythmic, something gentle. The theatre was one of the most celebrated forms of public leisure, and while performances could be grand, attending them was part of the social rhythm. In Athens, during festivals like the Dionysia, people from every class gathered to watch tragedies and comedies performed in open-air theatres built into the hillside. The plays weren't purely entertainment. They were acts of civic reflection. They explored duty, justice, fate, love, and laughter. And everyone, rich, poor, citizen, foreigner, watched them together under the same sky. The audience brought food, cushions, friends. The performance might last all day with breaks between plays. At the end, winners were chosen and names remembered. But the experience of listening together, feeling together, was what stayed. Now let's return to the home, near nightfall. The air is cooler. The sky deepens from blue to indigo. A gentle breeze stirs the leaves in the courtyard. Inside, someone lights a small oil lamp. its flame soft and golden. A basin of water is poured, and hands are washed. The feet are rinsed of dust. A bit of oil is dabbed behind the ears. A fresh tunic is slipped over the shoulders. The day's labor has been washed away, and what remains is softness. Perhaps a visitor comes, an old friend or a cousin from the next house. They sit together, eat fruit, sip wine slowly. Someone tells a story, not a myth or a legend, but something remembered from a market day long ago. The story ends not with a laugh, but with a smile. A shared silence follows. That too is leisure, the kind that nourishes, the kind that doesn't ask anything, the kind that simply is. Festivals brought another kind of rest, joyful, public, and woven into the sacred calendar. Each polis had its own festivals, dedicated to gods and heroes. In Athens, there was the Panathenaia, honoring Athena. It included processions, sacrifices, feasting, and athletic competitions. Families walked together. Girls carried sacred vessels. Boys raced on foot or horseback. Older men watched with pride. Women prayed with quiet intensity. Other festivals honored Dionysus with wine and laughter, or Demeter with solemn rites for the harvest. Some were daytime events. Others took place by torchlight, with dancing that lasted deep into the night. These festivals offered not just joy, but release. Release from toil, from worry, from solitude. They brought people together, reaffirmed the bonds of city and spirit. Even those who worked hardest found space in these days to simply be, to eat well, to wear clean clothes, to feel the breeze of celebration on their skin. And now, the last part of the day begins. The city quiets. The last market stalls are folded. The fountain no longer echoes with chatter. In the hills, goats settle in their pens. In the harbours, sails are tied down for the night. The home glows faintly with lamplight. A song is hummed without words. A pot is washed and turned upside down to dry. The body stretches. The breath slows. In ancient Greece, leisure wasn't separate from life. It was stitched between the rows of labour, woven like thread into the day, never rushed, never hoarded, just there. And so, as your own breath slows, you might imagine yourself reclining gently on a stone bench under a vine-covered pergola, listening to the rustle of leaves above and the distant sound of a flute carried by the evening air. You are not alone. There is no urgency. There is only this moment. And in this moment, you are at rest. The sun has just risen again. You step into the courtyard of a familiar home. The air is cool, fresh, still waking. There is a silence, but it's not empty. It feels attentive, present. Something gentle is about to begin. In ancient Greece, life and ritual were never far apart. Even the smallest moment, bathing, baking, harvesting, traveling, could become an offering. The sacred was not distant. It lived alongside the daily. It breathed in the same rooms, slept in the same house, watched over every threshold. To live well was not just to work or speak wisely. It was to honor the rhythms of the divine. Let's walk quietly into that world. Every home had its hearth, a place not only of warmth, but of worship. At the center of the hearth was Hestia, goddess of the home and the fire that never dies. Each morning, before the household stirred too much, a small offering was made, a drop of oil, a pinch of barley flour, a whispered word. This wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was habitual, like breath, a way of anchoring the day. The hearth was sacred. When a child was born, it was presented there, introduced to the spirits of the home. When a bride entered her husband's house, she circled the hearth in silence, an act of joining, of belonging. Fire was never taken lightly. It was borrowed carefully from another flame, carried in a protected vessel, and fed with purpose. And in the quiet glow of that fire, families gathered, not only for warmth, but to remember that they were not alone. The household shrine, the Herkios, was often near the courtyard or threshold. It honored Zeus Herkios, protector of the home's boundaries, and sometimes Apollo, Hermes, or family ancestors. A small altar stood there, perhaps just a stone shelf or a painted niche. Each evening, a bit of wine or fruit was placed there, sometimes a sprig of fresh herbs or a coin. Children learned early to bow their heads, to give thanks with an open hand. It was not fear that guided these gestures. It was familiarity. The gods were not strangers. They were part of the household. They watched. They waited. They listened. In the streets, Hermes was present at every corner. Small statues of him, called Herms, stood at intersections, markets, and doorways. A square pillar topped with his head, sometimes carved with protective symbols. Travelers would touch the base before a journey. Merchants might pour wine over the stone. Even a child, walking to the well, might glance at the Herm and murmur a greeting. Hermes was the god of transitions, of movement, thresholds, and messages. He belonged to every in-between space, and in a world of open roads and uncertain winds, his presence was a comfort. Rituals weren't confined to temples. They were stitched into the body of the day. Before a journey, a libation was poured. Before a meal, a first bite was offered to the gods. Before planting a seed, a prayer was spoken into the soil. These weren't burdens. They were habits of gratitude. They kept life in rhythm with something older, wiser, and unseen. And on certain days, days marked on the lunar calendar, or tied to sacred anniversaries, the rituals grew larger. Let's visit a domestic festival. In Athens, once a year, the women of a household might gather for the Thesmophoria, a festival honoring Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and her daughter, Persephone. This was a festival of women only. They prepared days in advance, baking special cakes, gathering herbs, and cleansing themselves in sacred water. At dawn, they climbed to a hill outside the city, where they camped for 3 days. They fasted, shared stories, performed rites passed down for generations. There were no spectators, no records, no outsiders, only the women, the earth, and the memory of grief and renewal. It was a time for mourning and for hope, for planting what must die in order to return, and for honoring the cycles that govern not only the soil, but the human spirit. Men, too, had festivals. One of the most sacred was the Aperturia, where male citizens presented their sons to the phratry, a kinship group that anchored social life. The boy stood before the assembled men. His name was spoken aloud. A drop of blood from a sacrificial animal sealed the moment. From that day forward, he was not just a child, but a member of the polis. This was not spectacle. It was continuity. It reminded each man of who he was and who came before him. In the fields, even sowing and harvest carried sacred weight. Before the grain was planted, a sacrifice was made. Not always an animal, sometimes just a handful of flour, a song, or a garland of wheat woven by a child. When the harvest came, the first sheaf was offered to Demeter. It was bound in linen, laid gently on the earth, and left to the sky. In return, the people asked not for wealth, but for sufficiency, enough to feed the children, enough to last the winter, enough to keep life turning, one season at a time. Death, too, was surrounded by ritual, not to ward off fear, but to honor what passed. When someone died, the women of the family prepared the body. They washed it, anointed it with oil, wrapped it in linen. A coin was placed in the mouth for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. Mourners gathered, not to make speeches, but to sing laments, threnoi songs of sorrow that remembered the dead without forgetting the beauty of their life. A procession wound through the streets early in the morning to avoid the heat. At the tomb, libations were poured, a few words spoken, hands dusted with earth. Then came the meal, a quiet feast shared in remembrance. Bread, olives, wine, a piece of fruit, nothing elaborate, but sacred all the same. In the weeks that followed, the grave was visited, offerings left, the names spoken aloud. The dead were not far. They lived on in memory, in custom, in the soft curve of a cheek, or the way a child held a cup. In every city, great temples rose from the hills, columns stretching skyward, statues of marble, bronze, and gold. But religion was not confined to marble. It lived in the flicker of an oil lamp, in the hush of silence before a meal, in the hand that lifted a sprig of laurel and placed it on a threshold. The sacred was not a separate world. It was this world, seen with attention. And so, in this moment, wherever you are, you might feel something of that ancient presence, not as thunder, not as miracle, but as breath. The breath you take before speaking someone's name, the breath before walking through a doorway, the breath before resting your head and letting the day slip quietly into memory. That is where the sacred lives, in stillness, in rhythm, in return. Let's begin at the very start, with the birth of a child. The house is quiet. Someone moves gently through the doorway, carrying a small oil lamp. In the courtyard, herbs hang drying from a beam. Bay leaves, dittany, lavender. A soft basin of water sits nearby, warmed from earlier in the day. The birth has taken place inside. Not in the hospital, not with a doctor, but at home, helped along by other women. A midwife, perhaps, or an older relative who has seen this before. There is no anesthesia, no machines, only human voices, cloth and steady, practiced hands. And then, a sound, the first cry of new life. In ancient Greece, childbirth was both sacred and perilous. It was attended with prayers to Artemis, protector of women and children. Offerings might be made beforehand, flowers, barley cakes, a lock of hair. And when the child was born safely, the household gave thanks, softly and without fanfare. After birth, the infant was not immediately accepted into the family. Instead, for several days, it was observed, watched for health, for signs of strength or vitality. In a world without modern medicine, many children did not survive their first year. But if the child thrived, a naming ritual was held on the 7th or 10th day. This ritual, called the decade, was quiet and intimate. The father held the child and walked around the hearth, introducing it to the household gods. The family gathered. A small sacrifice might be offered. Bread and wine were shared. The child received a name, often from a grandparent or ancestor, linking them to the family's past. There was no written certificate, no official registry. But from that moment forward, the child belonged to the oikos, the home, the lineage, the story. Infancy was tender. Babies were wrapped in swaddling cloth, carried in arms, soothed with lullabies. Mothers nursed their children, or in wealthier homes, a wet nurse might take on that role. Small wooden toys were given, a ball, a carved animal, a rattle filled with pebbles. They did not have cribs in the modern sense. Infants slept close to their mothers, on mats or blankets stuffed with wool. Sleep was lighter, interrupted, always attended by someone nearby. As the child grew, they began to toddle across the courtyard. Older siblings watched. A grandmother might sit in the shade and guide a child's hand as they played with pebbles or sang a counting rhyme. There was little separation between generations. The household was a shared space of learning, play, and quiet care. By the age of 3 or 4, children had begun to absorb the rhythms of the home. They learned how to carry a small jug of water, how to fold a cloth, how to watch the sky for signs of weather. Play and learning were not separate. They were part of the same experience. Girls and boys played together when young. They had dolls made of terracotta or cloth, knuckle bones, hoops, spinning tops, and balls filled with air or wrapped with string. They ran, climbed, skipped stones. They imitated their parents, pretending to cook, sew, or carry messages. They told each other short stories they'd heard from adults, fragments of myth, jokes, riddles, and always they listened. To the adults speaking in low tones, to the sounds of animals, of merchants, of the loom, to the world moving around them. By the age of 7, childhood began to change. This was the age at which formal education began for boys, and at which girls were gradually drawn into the world of domestic duties and rituals. For a boy in Athens, each morning began with a simple meal, perhaps barley bread dipped in diluted wine. He put on his chiton, tied his sandals, and walked with a pedagogue, a trusted household slave or older male guardian, to his teacher's home or small schoolroom. There were no grand buildings for learning. Lessons were held in courtyards, porches, or shaded rooms, sitting cross-legged on mats. The teacher, called a didaskalos, used a wax tablet and stylus to teach letters. Boys learned the alphabet by tracing, chanting, copying, then words, then lines of Homer. Poetry was central, not just for beauty, but as a way to memorize ethics, language, identity. They also studied kithristik, music with the lyre, and gymnastic, physical training. The idea was to shape the full person, mind, body, voice, and character. Girls, in contrast, remained at home, but their education was no less vital, just different in form. They learned from mothers, grandmothers, and female slaves, how to spin wool into thread, how to mix herbs into medicines, how to bake bread, measure grain, and keep records of household stores. They learned prayers, songs, and the timing of festivals. They practiced walking gracefully, speaking with modesty, and wearing the hymation correctly. Some learned to read and write, especially in wealthier homes, but literacy was not expected. Their education was not public, but it was layered with memory, tradition, and quiet skill. As children aged, their roles expanded. A 10-year-old boy might help carry baskets from the market or attend a festival with his father. He might begin to shadow craftsmen, watching the potter's wheel, the carpenter's chisel. A girl of the same age might help prepare offerings for Athena, fold a wedding garment, or mind younger siblings. They watched, listened, absorbed the pace of adulthood, and slowly they were invited in. Around age 12 to 14, the changes deepened. For boys, this was the time to begin more serious physical training. At the palaestra, a kind of gymnasium, they practiced wrestling, javelin, long jump, and running. There were contests, but not for glory. The goal was discipline, sophrosyne, a kind of self-control and balance. They learned music, math, and perhaps some rhetoric. They listened to older boys recite speeches, debate, and compose verses. This was preparation, not just for citizenship, but for identity. For girls, adolescence brought other rituals. At certain festivals, like the Arctia, honoring Artemis, young girls dressed as bears danced and sang in chorus. It was a rite of passage, marking the transition from childhood to maidenhood. Girls began to take on more responsibility in the home. They wove more complex patterns, managed stores, participated in religious processions. By their mid-teens, most girls were betrothed or married. Marriage marked the end of girlhood and the beginning of a new phase. One not marked by ceremony alone, but by a shift in presence, in duty, in space. The transition was often quiet, but for many, it was profound. In Sparta, the pattern was different. Boys left home at age 7 to live in barracks, trained by the state to become soldiers. They learned to endure pain, hunger, and silence. They learned to obey. Girls, too, were trained, not in weaving, but in strength. They ran races, wrestled, threw javelins, believing that strong women bore strong children. Sparta's childhood was harsher, but even there, rituals, songs, and games softened the path. Coming of age was gradual. For Athenian boys, citizenship was granted at age 18. They took an oath in the sanctuary of Aglaros, promising to defend the city and its laws. They served in the military, attended assemblies, and were given their place among men. For girls, adulthood was marked more quietly, by marriage, by managing a household, by motherhood. But for both, the memory of childhood remained. The sound of a mother's voice telling a story, the feel of clay between young fingers, the scent of a laurel wreath worn in a childhood festival. These moments endured, like the light of morning held deep in the folds of sleep. And so, growing up in ancient Greece was not only about learning to work or speak or marry. It was about becoming a part of something larger, a household, a city, a pattern of memory. It was slow, layered, human. And if you close your eyes now, you might feel again what it means to learn by watching, to grow by listening, to carry forward the voice of those who came before. This is what it means to grow, to remember, to become. Evening settles again over the house. In the courtyard, a few oil lamps flicker. A bowl of fruit rests beside a folded cloth. Someone hums softly, not for performance, but for presence, for the sound of company at the end of a long day. This is not the story of a hero or a general or a god. It's the story of how people lived beside each other, how they formed bonds, built families, sat quietly, shoulder to shoulder, without needing to speak. Let's linger here a while. Let's explore the shape of love, not in grand declarations, but in the structure of daily life. In ancient Greece, marriage was not a matter of romance, at least not at first. It was a social and economic agreement arranged between households, a means of continuing the family line, preserving property, and securing alliances. But within that structure, space existed for affection, for habit, for quiet understanding. Girls married young, often in their early to mid-teens. Boys usually later, late teens or early 20s, once they had begun their civic duties. The match was arranged by the Kyrios, the girl's male guardian, usually her father. He negotiated a dowry, not as payment, but as a contribution to the new household. Clothing, jewelry, utensils, perhaps servants or livestock. It was meant to provide stability for the bride if the marriage ended or her husband died. Consent, in our modern sense, was not required, but many fathers tried to arrange respectful unions. Marriage was not just a transaction. It was a step toward continuity. The wedding itself was a 3-day ritual, filled with symbols and soft, sacred gestures. The first day was for preparation. The bride bathed in sacred water, drawn from a special spring. She offered locks of her hair to Artemis, goddess of transitions, leaving behind her childhood. Women of the family prepared her clothing. often a richly dyed peplos or chiton, fastened with brooches, girdled at the waist. Her hair was braided, adorned with ribbons or a simple crown of myrtle. Scented oils were rubbed into her skin, frankincense, rose, or cinnamon. That night, songs were sung, old lullabies, wedding hymns, quiet laughter around the hearth. The second day was the day of the wedding proper. A sacrifice was made, perhaps a pig or goat, to ensure divine favor. A feast followed with bread, honey, figs, and wine. At dusk, the bride was led from her father's home to that of her husband. She sat in a cart or on a mule, veiled in saffron-colored cloth. Torches lit the way. Musicians played flutes and lyres. The procession was watched by neighbors, some silent, some cheering. At the threshold of the new home, the bride was welcomed by her husband's family. She was offered figs and dates, a sign of fertility and sweetness. She stepped across the threshold carefully, her veil still drawn, her new life beginning. That night, the couple shared a room, its bed prepared with fresh linens and garlands. There was no ceremony, no public display, only a quiet joining of households under the eyes of the gods. On the third day, gifts were exchanged. The bride's family might bring more clothing, bedding, or household items. Neighbors came to offer congratulations and to witness the stability of the union. There were no formal vows, no legal contract beyond the dowry. But from this day forward, the woman was nymph, a bride, and in time, Gain, a wife. Within the home, husband and wife occupied different spaces, socially and physically. The man moved freely in the public world, market, assembly, gymnasium, symposium. The woman was expected to tend to the home, manage the servants, raise the children, and maintain the rituals of the household gods. But that doesn't mean she was absent from life. She was the keeper of continuity, the weaver not only of cloth, but of family memory, seasonal rhythm, and quiet resilience. Some marriages were distant, others warm. Some were practical, others affectionate. Over time, many couples grew into one another, not through words, but through shared habits, shared labor, shared silence. He might bring her almonds from the market. She might warm his cloak by the fire before he returned home. They might watch their children sleep and remember the first fig tree they planted together. There was no need to speak it. It was already known. Love, in its various forms, was a subject of poetry, drama, and philosophy. Poets like Sappho wrote of longing, tenderness, and the softness of female love. Verses whispered from woman to woman, filled with flowers, laughter, and stolen glances. Men often wrote about love between men, structured through the educational and mentorship bonds of Erastes and Eromenos, where an older man guided a younger, sometimes with affection, sometimes with desire. This too was shaped by custom, age, and city. Not every bond was the same, but in daily life, love was quieter. It lived not in verse, but in routine, in the way someone prepared your favorite meal, or remembered how you liked your tunic folded, or laughed at a story they'd heard 100 times before, just to let you tell it again. Children were central to family life, not just for inheritance, but for meaning. A child's first steps were marked with delight, their first words told again and again. Tiny sandals were hung on a peg when they were outgrown, not discarded, but saved. Naming followed patterns. A son might be named after his grandfather, a daughter after her grandmother. This wasn't just honor, it was continuity. The living carried the memory of the dead. Birthdays were not widely celebrated, but certain days of the month were sacred to different gods, and each child had a special offering day. And when a child was sick, it was the mother who prayed, not always aloud, but with both hands clasped at her chest. She rubbed oil on the child's feet. She sang old songs. She kept the hearth flame alive until morning. Elders lived within the home, not apart from it. Grandparents helped raise children, passed down stories, tended the fire when others were away. Age was honored, not for its productivity, but for its memory. An old man might sit in the sun, telling riddles to children. An old woman might hum a weaving song, even if her hands no longer moved with ease. They were not set aside. They were the past made present. In moments of celebration, weddings, births, harvests, families gathered. Wine was poured. Simple foods were prepared. Olive wreaths crowned young heads. Evening songs were shared, not from a stage, but around a table. And in moments of grief, the family grieved together. They tore cloth. They wailed aloud. They told stories of the departed. They lit lamps. They watched the stars in silence. In this way, family life in ancient Greece was both structured and intimate, marked by roles but softened by time, bound by duty but shaped by care. And love, if it came, was not shouted from rooftops. It was stirred gently into soup. It was sewn into the hem of a child's garment. It was the way someone remembered to leave a light burning at the doorway, small, steady, enduring. So now, as the house falls quiet once more, you might imagine yourself sitting on a worn stone bench in the courtyard of that ancient home. The children are asleep. The fire has gone low. The night is deep and still. And beside you, someone sits quietly, doing nothing, saying nothing, just breathing with you in the silence. And that perhaps is love too. Time in the ancient Greek world did not tick or chime. There were no clocks on the wall, no buzzing reminders, no sharp alerts. Instead, time flowed, like water through a shaded stream. It circled, like the moon. It whispered its passage in the scent of ripening figs, the turning of leaves, the tilt of the light at dusk. To live in ancient Greece was to live close to the sky, and to the soil, and to the breath of the gods, carried in the warmth of wind or the quiet hush of a winter rain. Let's step slowly into that rhythm. Let's feel time as they felt it, not in seconds, but in seasons. The Greek calendar was lunar. Months began not with a number, but with the first sliver of moonlight in the evening sky. People looked upward, not downward at their wrists, to understand where they were in the great spiral of the year. Each city-state, each polis, had its own calendar, its own names for the months, its own sacred days, its own rhythms of celebration. But across the Greek world, the same larger shape repeated: spring, summer, autumn, winter. Each season carried its own labor, its own festivals, its own slow wisdom. Spring arrived not on a date, but in signs. The almond trees bloomed first, white petals like snow clinging to bare branches. Then came the bees, thick in the air, buzzing low in the groves. Barley fields turned soft green, and lambs bleated beside their mothers in the shade. This was the time of rebirth, of planting, blessing, and preparation. Women offered flowers to Demeter, goddess of growth. Farmers touched the soil with their bare hands, sensing its readiness. The first furrow of the plough was marked with prayer, sometimes with a sacrifice. An egg, a bit of wine, a whispered word. Children ran barefoot again. Old people sat in the sun, feeling the warmth return to their bones. Festivals like the Anthesteria, honoring Dionysus, marked the new wine season. 3 days of tasting, laughter, and gentle celebration of life's renewal. It was not hurried. It was not loud. It was simply returning. Summer came with brightness and stillness. The days grew long. Cicadas began their chorus in the trees, high, constant, peaceful. Work shifted earlier in the day before the heat could rise too high. At noon, silence returned. People rested in the shade, drank cool water mixed with vinegar, and listened to the soft rustle of olive leaves overhead. The wheat was harvested, cut by hand, gathered into bundles, beaten to free the grain. In the cities, people prepared for the Panathenaia, Athens' great festival of Athena. There were athletic games, poetry contests, and processions through the city. But even during celebrations, the earth's pulse could be felt, the scent of figs ripening in the sun, the feel of sand on bare feet, the lazy drift of shadows across the courtyard wall. Summer was abundance, but also patience. It reminded people to wait, to pause, to endure heat and stillness with grace. At night, families slept on rooftops under the stars. They pointed to constellations and told stories older than memory. Autumn brought movement again. The air cooled. The winds changed. Grapes were harvested, crushed by foot in stone presses. The juice gathered for wine. The hills filled with the scent of fermenting fruit. Women laid out nuts to dry. Men turned the soil for winter crops. Children helped collect olives one by one into wide baskets. The Thesmophoria, a women's festival for Demeter and Persephone, marked the descent into the darker half of the year. It was a time for memory, for mourning, but also for hope. People began to prepare their homes, patching roofs, storing oil, sewing thicker tunics. There was a gentleness to this work, a readiness, not sadness, but a quiet bowing to the year's turning. Winter was stillness. The days were short. Fires burned longer. The wind whispered through shuttered windows, and rain tapped gently on clay roofs. This was the time of the hearth. Families sat closer together. Bread was baked with care. Stories were told, not to teach, but to accompany the flicker of flame. The fields rested. Tools were cleaned, oiled, and set aside. Even the gods grew quiet in winter. Only a few festivals dotted the season, like the rural Dionysia, when villages brought out old masks and reenacted the sacred stories of wine, madness, and joy. It was a time to look inward, to remember, to be still. Beyond the seasons, the Greeks marked time through life events: birth, naming, first steps, first tooth, first haircut. Each came with its own rite, its own small anchor in the stream of becoming. And then came marriage, children, age, memory. Each moment was not just personal. It was part of the larger rhythm, the individual life echoing the movement of stars, fields, and flame. Even the passing of the dead was part of the calendar. Each year, on the anniversary of a loved one's death, families returned to the grave. They brought offerings, olives, bread, wine, a lock of hair. They sat quietly. They spoke the name aloud, not in sadness, but in remembrance, as if to say, "You are still part of this turning. You are still here." The Greeks had no single New Year's Day. Instead, the year renewed itself in many ways. Through the moon, through the harvest, through the stories told again around the fire. Their time was not linear. It did not march forward. It circled, like the moon, like the cycle of planting and reaping, like the rhythm of sleep and waking. And through this circle, they found a kind of peace, not freedom from change, but trust in its return. So now, if you feel the quiet rising around you, if you notice the stillness behind the sound of this voice, that is your own rhythm answering back, your own breath echoing the ancient wind through olive branches, your own heartbeat pacing the steps of a child in spring. Your own silence, matching the hush of a winter fire. You are not apart from time. You are moving within it. And for now, you are allowed to rest. Let us slow down now, even more than before. Not to look at temples or rituals or grand ideas, but to sit for a while with the smallest details. The fabric of a tunic, the scent of garlic and onions cooking in oil, the sound of sandals on stone, because this is what daily life truly was. Not only thoughts or beliefs, but things, objects, textures, smells, what people wore, what they touched, what they tasted. Let's begin with clothing. Not what a statue wore, but what a potter put on in the morning. What a child wore while playing. What a woman draped across her shoulders in the chill before dawn. Most ancient Greeks owned very few garments. There were no closets packed with options. No mirrors for long decisions. Clothing was simple, functional, and deeply familiar. The most basic garment was the chiton, a rectangle of fabric, folded and fastened at the shoulders with brooches or pins, then belted at the waist. For men, the chiton might be short, ending above the knees for ease in work or movement. For women, it was longer, reaching the ankles, belted just under the bust or at the waist. In cooler weather, a himation, a heavier cloak, was worn. Draped over one shoulder, it added warmth and formality. You wrapped yourself in it like a blanket, not tight, just enough to shield from the wind. Children often went without much in summer, perhaps just a short tunic, or even nothing at all, depending on the household. There was little sense of shame, especially among the very young. Fabrics were almost always wool or linen. Wool came from sheep kept in the hills. Each year they were sheared. The wool cleaned, combed, spun into thread, then woven on an upright loom. This was slow work, carried out in the women's quarters, in long hours of soft conversation or quiet thought. The loom stood tall, and the warp threads stretched downward like lines of rainfall. The weft thread moved side to side, pressed with a comb, until patterns began to appear. Cloth might be left its natural off-white, or dyed with plant pigments, rusty reds from madder root, soft yellows from saffron, muted blues from woad. Bright colours were rare but not unknown. Most garments were not cut or sewn. They were woven to size and draped with care. There were no buttons, no zippers, just ties, folds, pins. The result was clothing that moved with the body, soft, airy, rhythmic. When worn, it whispered. Sandals were made of leather, cut, punched and strapped by hand. The soles were thick enough for gravel roads, thin enough to feel the ground. Feet were washed each night, rubbed with oil, often without speaking. Jewelry, for those who had it, was simple. A bronze ring, an amulet on a cord, perhaps earrings or a delicate bracelet. Nothing too heavy, nothing wasted. Adornment was part of dignity, not vanity. Hair was combed with bone or wood. Men kept it short or tied at the nape. Women braided it, coiled it, pinned it with care. Scented oils were made by steeping herbs or flowers in olive oil, then applied to the skin not as perfume, but as comfort. A touch behind the ears, at the wrists, at the base of the neck. Now let's turn to food. The day began early. The first meal was light, called akritisma, just a piece of barley bread, dipped in diluted wine. Sometimes a bit of cheese, a fig, or olives left over from the night before. Bread was made from barley or wheat, ground at home on a stone quern, then mixed with water, salt, and perhaps a little yeast from an old dough. The loaves were flat, dense, baked in clay ovens or over coals. The smell of baking was a daily comfort. warm and nutty, mingling with the scent of smoke and dust. Lunch, Ariston, was often eaten outside the home, especially for men working in the agora or the fields. It might be bread with onions, olives, dried fish, or fruit. Something simple, carried in a cloth, eaten quickly beneath the shade of a tree. Evening brought the main meal, deipnon. Families gathered in the courtyard or dining room. The table was low, dishes were shared. There were no individual plates. Each person used bread as a scoop, dipping into bowls of lentils, stewed vegetables, beans or fish. Meat was rare. It appeared during festivals or sacrifices: goat, lamb, pork, sometimes wild birds. But for most, meat was a flavor, not a portion. Cheese was made from goat or sheep milk, soft, white, crumbly. Fruits were seasonal: figs, grapes, apples, pomegranates. Nuts, walnuts, almonds, pine nuts were treats. Honey sweetened everything. There was no sugar. A fig cake brushed with honey, a bowl of yogurt drizzled with it. These were desserts. Wine was always diluted with water. To drink it unmixed was considered crude, even dangerous. It wasn't about intoxication. It was about balance. Utensils were few. Spoons sometimes. Knives always. Forks were unknown. Hands were washed before and after the meal, often with scented water poured from a small jug. After eating, the floor was swept. The leftovers shared with animals or neighbors. Gratitude was given, not always allowed, but through action. A drop of wine poured to the gods, a crust of bread placed near the hearth, not much, just enough to say, "We remember." Every object in the kitchen had a purpose: clay pots for boiling or baking, amphorae for storing oil or wine, mortars for grinding garlic, herbs, and salt. There were no metal pans, no glass jars, no elaborate tools, but everything worked. Everything had weight and memory. A knife worn smooth from years of cutting. A cup passed down from a grandmother, chipped at the rim, still used each night. Even cooking sounds were familiar and soothing. The crackle of olive wood catching fire, the hiss of onions dropped into oil, the steady rhythm of stirring, of tasting, of waiting. And afterward, the scent lingered: garlic, thyme, lemon, woven into the fabric of the house. Children learned these textures early. They kneaded dough with sticky fingers. They carried baskets of herbs to the courtyard. They licked honey from their wrists. Learning to cook wasn't a lesson. It was participation. Being near, watching, touching, tasting. It was love, folded into action. Even in hardship, the Greeks found ways to create comfort in food. When grain was scarce, they made cakes from chickpea flour. When wine ran low, they drank kykeon, a barley and herb drink, nourishing and filling. They boiled greens for soup, preserved olives, dried fish in the sun. There was no waste. Everything had a use. Every part of the animal, every peel, every stem. This frugality was not shameful. It was skillful. It was survival with grace. In the evening, after the meal, the dishes were stacked neatly. The coals left to cool. The oil lamp lit. Someone would take a bit of oil, rub it into their hands, and let the day soften. So much of life was texture: the scratch of wool on skin, the smoothness of worn pottery, the softness of fig flesh on the tongue. Even time itself was measured by these things: the feel of warm bread in the hand, the color of ripening grapes, the weight of a clay jug when full and when empty. This was daily life. Not extraordinary, not heroic, but steady, familiar, enduring. And so, if you feel your own body now, your shoulders softening, your breath easing, your hands resting, know that you are sharing in the same rhythm, the same pulse of living that echoed through courtyards, workshops, kitchens and fields. Not loudly, but clearly, and always with care. Let's return once more to the courtyard. The air is cool, but not cold. A few dry leaves stir in the corners. A faint scent of olive oil lingers on the air. In the shadow of the wall, someone sits quietly, not working, not waiting, just being. This is an old man, or an old woman. Their hair is silver, their hands are worn, their eyes no longer scan but rest. They are not alone. A child plays nearby, a clay cup rests beside them. The sun moves slowly across the courtyard floor. In ancient Greece, aging was not resisted. It was not hidden. It was accepted as part of the great unfolding. One season following another, one day leaning gently into the next. Growing old was not always easy. The body grew slower. The joints stiffened. The breath shortened. But old age also brought a kind of authority, what the Greeks call Sophia. Wisdom not from books, but from experience. A life lived close to the earth, the gods, and the everyday. An elder might no longer work the fields, but they knew when the rains would come. They might not weave any more, but they remembered the song that went with the spindle. Their value did not lie in what they produced. It lived in what they remembered, and in what they passed on. There was no retirement in ancient Greece, but there was a softening, a slowing, a handing over. A grandfather might teach his grandson to use a tool, then sit back and watch. A grandmother might sing old songs while others baked the bread. They became anchors, still points in a world that kept turning, and in return, the household cared for them. A cushion in the sun, a warm cloak in winter, a bowl of soup brought without asking. These gestures spoke what words did not need to. Aging was also a time of storytelling. Old people told tales, not just of gods and heroes, but of their own youth, of a day the market flooded, of the first time they saw the sea, of a fig tree planted when they were newly married, now tall enough to shade the courtyard. These stories were not for entertainment. They were continuity. They helped the young know where they came from, and that they belonged to something older than themselves. Memory was a form of love. Death, too, was part of life. It was not rushed toward, nor was it feared in the way we sometimes fear it now. It was expected, prepared for, welcomed when the time came, with quiet dignity. Signs were noticed: a long illness, a sudden stillness, the withdrawing of appetite. The family gathered, not to weep yet, but to begin the slow work of letting go. Women, especially mothers, daughters, and sisters, took the lead. They washed the body, anointed it with oil, dressed it in a clean tunic, often white, laid it out on a simple bed or mat, hands folded, eyes closed. A small coin was placed in the mouth for Karen, the ferryman who carried souls across the river to the afterlife. Garlands of laurel or myrtle might be placed around the body. A clay vessel of water was set outside the door for ritual cleansing by visitors. Mourning began with laments. These were not abstract prayers. They were songs, sung aloud, often by the women of the family, sometimes improvised. They told the story of the one who had died. They called them by name. They wept not just for the loss, but for the beauty of what had been. The funeral took place before sunrise. The body was carried through the streets by relatives or hired bearers. At the tomb, often just a simple stone marker. Words were spoken, oil poured, a piece of bread broken and shared. The earth was closed gently over the body. The mourners turned homeward, walking slowly in the growing light. But mourning did not end that day. For days afterward, the house was kept quiet. No festivals were attended, no bright clothes worn. At regular intervals, 9 days, 30 days, and each year, the The family returned to the grave. They brought offerings, bread, wine, fruit, flowers. They sat, they remembered, they spoke the name. This was called mnemosinon, a remembrance. To speak the name aloud was to say, you are not gone, you are still with us. Some people left behind simple wills, especially if property was involved. Others left instructions for their burial, a favorite song, a specific garment, a place on the family land. But most left only memory, a touch, a scent, a story. The way their laugh echoed through the courtyard, or the way they folded their hands when listening. The Greeks believed in some form of afterlife, though views varied. Some imagined the Elysian fields, a place of peace beyond the western horizon. Others imagined a shadowy underworld ruled by Hades, where all souls drifted, neither punished nor praised. But for many, the focus remained here, among the living, in the practices that honored the dead, in the way they were remembered in the hearth's flame, in the olive tree planted in their name, in the child who carried their voice. So aging was not the end of usefulness. It was the completion of a circle, a time to be held by the hands you once held, a time to rest where once you labored, a time to be remembered not for your achievements, but for your presence. And now, if your body has grown still, if your own breath has slowed to match the rhythm of this voice, you are resting in the same space, the space where memory is held, where aging is not decline, but deepening, where each wrinkle is a line of poetry, and each silence is full of song. You are not outside of this story, you are within it, and your presence, even now, is part of the great unfolding. The light changes, the shadows shift, and someone, somewhere, remembers your name. Part 11. You've traveled far, not across great distances, but through time, through the shape of quiet lives, through the rhythm of breath and labor and rest. And now you find yourself here again, still in that soft, familiar courtyard. It's late. The sky above is deep with stars. The olive branches sway gently, their silver leaves catching the light. Somewhere nearby, a dog shifts in its sleep. A child murmurs and rolls over. The coals in the hearth glow faintly. The house is quiet. The world is quiet. And so we pause. Not to summarize, not to explain, but to sit once more in the presence of what has passed. Over these hours, you've moved through a single day and a full life. You've stepped through the doorway of an ancient Greek home. You've stood beside the hearth. You've watched the sun rise and fall over barley fields and whitewashed walls. You've seen how people lived, not as heroes, not as legends, but as people, carrying water, kneading dough, braiding hair, sweeping the floor, raising children, honoring the gods, folding blankets at night. You've seen how time passed, not in minutes, but in seasons, in harvests, in festivals, in footsteps worn into the stone. You've seen how care was given, not with ceremony, but with presence. A lamp lit before dawn, a bowl of fruit saved for a neighbor, a child's hand held as sleep approached. You've heard their voices, soft, ordinary, familiar, and perhaps now they sound a little like your own. The world they lived in is not gone, not entirely. You can still feel it in the warmth of sunlight on stone, in the scent of bread baking, in the hush that settles when a room grows still and someone listens deeply. You carry it with you, because it is not the names or dates that matter most. It is the rhythm, and that rhythm of waking, working, laughing, resting has not changed so very much. So rest here a little longer if you wish. Let the sound of this voice become softer. Let the images fade into the quiet. There is nothing more to know tonight, Nothing more to remember. Only this, that life, ancient or present, is made not of great moments, but of small ones, repeated with care, and that you, in your quiet listening, have stepped inside that same rhythm. The lamp burns low, the fig tree stirs above you, sleep is near, and as the world slips gently into stillness, know this, you are part of the story now. Good night.